Hello, gentle students, gentle readers of the novel Dream of the Red Chamber, Hongloumeng. Today, I would like to speak a little bit about the life of the author of the novel, Xueqin, who lived in the 18th century during the Qing dynasty. His life reminds me of an old Latin phrase, ars longa vita brevis. Art lasts while life is brief. And I think that's true of Xueqin. He only lived to be in his, I think, late 40s. He did not live long. I'll mention this later, but his son died, and it so distressed Xueqin, the author of this novel, that he himself became ill and died. But I'd like to provide a brief summary of his life. And before one reads a novel, despite Michel Foucault's belief, well, his very playful acrobatic argument that there is no author, I think that is more interesting than accurate. But despite Foucault's argument that there is no author, one should get to know the author. Xueqin is considered perhaps China's greatest author of all time. And to neglect knowing about Xueqin is to neglect knowing about the novel itself. I would argue that is true of any literature. But in any case, I have read much Derrida and much Foucault, and have both enjoyed and taken umbrage with much of their arguments. So just a few things about Xueqin that I think might be helpful, some of his family background that will help set the context for the novel itself. In fact, if you could just imagine for a moment that the novel Hongloumeng very likely is a kind of mirror, a bipolar analog for the novel itself. The protagonist Jia Baoyu in the novel goes through a kind of catharsis, or a Bildungsroman story, where he is this protagonist that goes through a series of challenges and experiences that functions as both a hortatory tale and also as a didactic story. His ancestors, Xueqin's ancestors, help explain how Xueqin knew and lived the life that is described in the novel, the life of Jia Baoyu. So his ancestors included some very famous generals. I mean, we could trace his ancestry all the way back to the Wu Dai, the five dynasties after the Tang. We could go right after the Tang, and we could trace into the Ming dynasty, the late Ming, and then looking especially at the early Qing, during the reign of both Shunzhi, the first Qing. I hope I said Qing. The first Qing emperor was Shunzhi, and then you have Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. And most specifically, the reigns of Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong would have an influence upon the life of the Caos, and would play a very large role in the vicissitudes of the life of Xueqin. So let me just go through a few of his ancestors, and perhaps this will help contextualize Xueqin as an author and help contextualize the novel itself. His great-grandfather was a man by the name of Cao Zhenyuan, and Cao Zhenyuan was captured by the Manchus, and he was made a bondservant, a nucai, literally one could use the word slave, I guess. He was made a bondservant in a banner army, the White Banner Army, which gave his family a kind of, but a very favored status with the Manchu court. Cao Zhenyuan served under a Manchu general by the name of Tong Yangxing, and Tong Yangxing, his grandniece, was the mother of the Kangxi emperor. Well, that is to already say that the first emperor of the Hai Qing, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, the first emperor of the Hai Qing, his mother had a relationship to the White Banner Army and to this general Tongyangxing who was the owner, I guess, of Cao Zhenyuan. And then Cao Xueqin's great-grandfather, so that's his great-great-grandfather. Cao Zhenyuan is Cao Xueqin's great-great-grandfather. His great-grandfather is someone by the name of Cao Xi, and Cao Xi was a palace guard for the Kangxi Emperor, and was appointed to be the commissioner for the imperial textile supplies in Nanjing, which was at that point a very powerful, very significant area politically for the Qing court. And Cao Xi was appointed this commissioner, this textile supply place, this imperial textile supply in 1663. He had, I think Cao Xi had something like 3,000 employees under him, and he was really outrageously wealthy because of his position. Cao Xi's wife was Cao Xi's nanny. Again, you see this important connection between the imperial court, or the emperor himself, and the Cao family. So Cao Xi's son, Cao Yin, was probably a childhood companion of Kangxi. They most likely knew one another, Cao Xi's son and his name is Cao Yin, and the Emperor Kangxi. They moved to Suzhou. Suzhou is clearly China's very famous textile city. They moved to Suzhou to be a textile commissioner, and then moved to Nanjing. So both of these really important textile areas in the Qing dynasty were where the Cao family served as textile officials. Cao Yin was a gifted writer. He wrote plays and poetry. So again, Cao Yin is Cao Xi's son. So Cao Zhenyuan, Cao Xi, and then Cao Yin. Cao Yin was very well trained in Chinese poetry, Chinese classics, and Chinese history. There was actually 4 times that Cao Yin hosted the Kangxi Emperor when the Kangxi Emperor was making one of his circuits down into the south. If you look at chapter, I think it's 18 in the novel, Dream of the Red Chamber, Yuan Chun, the daughter of Jia Zheng, the sister of Jia Baoyu, there is an imperial visit to the Jia estate. And that imperial visit very much depicts what it was like when, for example, when the Kangxi Emperor visited Cao Yin's home in the south of China. So it was literally within the genetic makeup of the Cao family to have had, and I mean by this the culture and the placement of the family, to have had this experience wherein the emperor or important people within the imperial court would visit their household. Cao Yin was an extravagant spender. He liked living very extravagantly. So Cao Yin actually went deeply into debt during his lifetime. And when Cao Yin died, the emperor, who was very fond of Cao Yin, appointed his only son, Cao Yong, to be the textile commissioner of Nanjing. Cao Yong died only 3 years after he had been given that post. And then the emperor ordered Cao Yong's wife to adopt Cao Yong's nephew, Cao Fu, to be a posthumous son, and then he inherited Cao Yong's position, right? So Cao Yong is given this position. He dies only 3 years later, and then the Cao Yong's wife adopts Cao Yong's nephew. Now, what's going to be important here, right, is Cao Yong's wife, who, in English translation is often described as Old Lady Li. She is the model after which Grandmother Jia is based. And the texts that try to describe who was Cao Xueqin's father tend to disagree. I think the text that I've read the most of argue that Cao Xueqin was the posthumous son of Lady Li, the posthumous son, not of Lady Li, the posthumous son of Taoyong, and the son of Lady Li. Some people have argued, I think maybe David Hawkes may have argued this, that Cao Xueqin was actually the son of Cao Fu, right? So, in any case, I'm of the school, I think that it was Taoyong who was the father of Cao Xueqin. When Cao Xueqin was raised, he was raised by Lady Li, right, which could have been his mother. But she raised him for more than 11 years. And thus, Cao Xueqin is raised in this very lavish setting, this very lavish estate, and very wealthy estate. And thus, he is given access to the lifestyle that he describes in the novel Hongloumeng. So the surrounding, the textiles, the sartorial culture, the tonsorial culture, the porcelain, the art, the library, the studies, the books one might read, all of those things were part of the life that Cao Xueqin was living within as a young boy, as he grew up, mostly as a very young boy. Well, what happened then is, so Cao Fu is the heir, he's the adopted heir of Taoyong's estate, and in 1728, Taoyong's, or now Cao Fu's estate was confiscated, and Cao Fu is dismissed from office. This is probably the source of the description of the confiscation, the seizure and confiscation of the Cao estates in the novel Hongloumeng. Cao Xueqin would have experienced this humility and this loss of the family's wealth, just as Jia Baoyu does in the novel itself. After Kangxi dies in 1722, his son Yongzheng seizes the throne, he's appointed to the throne. There's an awful lot of complicated history around Yongzheng's accession to the throne, but he takes power, but there is a struggle with his brothers and their allies. And the Taos were believed by the Yongzheng emperor, the Taos were believed to have been associated with one of his opponent brothers, and thus the Cao family is losing, or did lose, favor under the reign of Yongzheng. Cao Fu was allowed to move to Beijing with a small number of family members. That would include Cao Xueqin, and Cao Xueqin, along with Cao Fu, would move to Beijing, and this was probably arranged by the brother of Yongzheng, the brother's name is Prince Yinxiang, who had favored the Cao family. So Prince Yinxiang, the brother of Yongzheng, who had his favor, right? Who had Yongzheng's favor, also favored the Cao family. So the Cao family then moved to Beijing, and it was actually Prince Yinxiang's descendants who preserved copies of Cao Xueqin's Hongloumeng, Dream in the Red Chamber. So you're going to see the history of Cao Xueqin and the history of the novel all are enmeshed. The Cao family's connections, the Cao family's friends, these are people who will, during Cao Xueqin's life, read drafts of the novel and preserve his work and write about Cao Xueqin. Well, there was another political purge that happened in 1739, now under the new emperor, the Qianlong emperor. And the Cao family was implicated, and it lost any privilege that it had in Beijing at that time, right? So let me just pause here for a second and recount this, sort of underscore the important parts of Cao Xueqin's family history. They're connected in profound ways with the imperial family that will rule, the Manchu family that will rule the Qing dynasty. And they will also ride the waves of favor and disfavor as emperors like or dislike people with whom the Cao family has befriended. And this purge that will happen, or this dismissal from office and this family confiscation that happens in 1728, is the pinnacle moment, or the pinnacle moment, the nadir really, when the Cao family will lose its favor and be outrageously humiliated, and then the family will move to Beijing. So Cao Xueqin is witnessing all of this, and I think that's the important part, right? He understands imperial court culture, he understands high culture, but he is swept away by the winds of politics. So this purge that happens in 1739 causes the Cao family to lose its privilege in Beijing. Cao Xueqin is 24 years old when that happens. So he's still a young man. And it was around the time that his family lost any favor that he probably began to work on his draft of Hongloumeng. So he probably worked on it from about 1740 to 1750. So that means he worked on the novel for essentially 10 years. Sources suggest that he revised the entire story 5 times, and it's an incredibly complicated narrative, as you know if you're reading the novel, and thus it's incredible that he is so cohesive and so consistent within the narrative, but it's also expected and does happen that there are problems within the narrative. There are some contradictions and some holes in the novel itself in terms of some errors of the plot. So he worked as he's writing the novel. He's working as a clerk in a school for the children of bannermen who were nobility, and he is, even as a clerk, even as a sort of a family that has lost favor and lost its privileges, he's still within the precincts of the Manchu elites and is befriending them and knowing them, even knowing members of the nobility. So he's quite used to being around Manchus and Manchu culture. You can see that in the narrative. The Manchu salute will appear within the novel, and he will befriend the Prince of Beijing, and there are descriptions of going to court and donning the appropriate regalia for those rites. All of those things will appear in the novel that Cao Xueqin would have been accustomed to in his life. While he taught at the imperial school, he became friends with 2 Manchu brothers of the imperial family. That would be Dunming and Dunchang. Dunming and Dunchang, most of the first-hand info we have about Cao Xueqin comes from their poems about him. They're going to write poetry about Cao Xueqin, and in that poetry there are biographical details that we can glean from them and know more about his life. After he left the imperial school in, I think it was 1748, Cao moved from place to place, but he could not make a living. Finally, he moved to the countryside, west of Beijing, near the camp of the Plain White Banner. Again, the Plain White Banner is quite a prestigious, it's one of the top banners, not the top, but one of the top banners. And he made money by selling his own paintings. So Cao Xueqin was a painter. There's a great scene in the novel of Jia Baoyu's sister painting the garden, and Cao Xueqin will describe the process. Well, Xue Baochai will actually describe the process and make recommendations. But Cao Xueqin is able to describe painting in such detail because he was himself a painter. He may have passed the lowest level of the civil service exam systems, but he was adamantly Cao Xueqin, adamantly opposed to serving in government. I mean, Jia Baoyu refers to Confucians who want to serve in office as magistrates. He refers to them as career worms. Jia Baoyu, as did Cao Xueqin, have little regard for scholars who move up in the hierarchy. Other than the two brothers, Dunming and Duncheng, these two Manchu brothers, his closest friend was a man by the name of Zhang Yiquan, who was a school teacher. And Zhang, like the Dun brothers, Zhang wrote poetry about Cao Xueqin and about his life. So we know about Cao Xueqin through his poetry as well as the Dun brothers. So what can we say about Cao Xueqin's personal life? He was a great drinker, and in fact, he was, as sources suggest, always in debt with the wine shops because he bought out so much alcohol. He paid his wine debts with his paintings. So he, in a sense, he drank his money away while his family could only afford to eat, as one source says, his family could only afford to buy porridge to eat because he was drinking the family's income. His home was known to have been very poor, very rustic, and he was married twice. His first wife died, and then he had an infant son who died in the autumn of 1762. And according to the information about his life, according to our sources, he was so sad over the death of his son that he became ill, and he died himself on really the eve of the Lunar New Year on February 12th, 1763. So he was survived by his second wife, with whom he hadn't been married very long. He had just married her, actually. And accounts about him suggest that he was not only a gifted novelist, but he's also a gifted poet. It's clear if you read his poetry in the novel. He was a gifted painter, but he was also considered to have been a very talented singer and lute player. He was and this is the last thing I'll end with, he was known to have been a great admirer of women. And he writes about women with great accolades throughout the novel Hongloumeng. One conjures to mind the account of Zhan Baoyu being described as when he's being beaten by his father, he just calls out the word girls and is comforted and feels no pain. Of course, Baoyu very often says that boys are somehow filthy, but girls are pure, and this is something that we hear about Cao Xueqin, the author of the novel. Well, in that sense, we see that the notion of a cathartic experience, a Bildungsroman type of story, both applies to Cao Xueqin, the author of the novel, and Jia Baoyu, the protagonist in the novel. Their trajectories follow parallel paths, and the didactic ending of the novel, which the debate really is whether or not the last section of the novel was actually written by Cao Xueqin. The didactic nature of the novel reflects the life experiences of Cao Xueqin. Well, with that, I'll end. And as I always do, I wish everyone good health, 祝你们身体健康. And if you wish to know what happens next, please stay tuned to the next post and Ganbei.